I've been on a massive losing streak recently. Down from a high of 1700, it's dropped all the way down to 1400s. That's a 300 point drop. And look, there's a lot of reasons, certainly some more important than others, but I am going to blame my openings. So I'm going to help you try and avoid this same kind of 300 ELO drop by telling you which openings to avoid. And at the end of the video, I'll give you some examples of some good openings to avoid this kind of mistake. So I'm going to be talking about some common openings that you probably play and should probably start avoiding. I'll also be using the Lichess database to kind of back up these opinions with some data. And I'll show you the first one. So if you play e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bring your other knight out, this all looks super normal. This is actually what a lot of beginners are taught. Bring your knights out first. It's all good, but this is pretty much the lowest win rate opening for white. You've only got like a 48% win rate, which is pretty terrible if you're playing white. And the reason for this, I'm fairly sure, is just it's so common and it's so easy to play against for the black side. So this is something you want to avoid. There's really not too many traps, too many problems for black to get into. And like I was saying as well, you're playing a game where black is probably very comfortable, especially if this isn't your main opening. Like when I experiment with this, again, going back to that 300 ELO drop, I can lose some rating because black just seems to play out of their mind because they're just so used to this position. So if we're not playing the three knights as white with e4, you might be asking, well, what about d4? Is there an equivalent? And there definitely is. So if you play d4, d5, whoa, let's actually play the right opening. d4, d5, and then you play knight f3, and they play knight f6. This pretty much has the exact same problem again. It's just too easy to play. It is too common, and the win rate is very low here as well. Below, I think it's 51%, but there is so much better choices, especially in the d4 openings that we'll talk about later. So those are the two main openings I would avoid with the white pieces. You can get away with so much, so it's not as bad, but with black, you certainly have to be very careful. There's a lot of way for things to go wrong, and it's not just losing that advantage, right? Like 48%, it's still okay, even though white should probably be around that like 55, 60% if you're playing the right openings. As black, you might just get crushed out of the opening if you're not careful. So the first one I'm going to show you, and this is going to be very reminiscent of what we just saw. If you're playing e4, e5 as black, they play knight f3, you play knight c6. It's all super normal. And they play the Italian game, bishop c4, lining up on the pawn here. You don't want to play knight f6. Again, I'm struggling with the pieces here, but you do not want to play knight f6. Again, this looks so normal. We're just following that beginner advice. Bring your knights out first. But the problem with this is you're allowing the fried liver, or at least the entry to the fried liver. And this is just tough to deal with. There's just a lot of ways black can go wrong. And in general, when you're playing black, you want to try and avoid these sharp lines that white is throwing at you. Because you can study the theory a lot as black. You can be super confident against the fried liver and some other openings we'll run into later. But it's just difficult. White still plays it more. They're probably more used to the theory as well. And yeah, the stats, they're not good. Again, it's almost 60%, I think, if you allow the fried liver in this kind of way, because it's just tough. Again, you've probably seen the lines. You have to play d5, this kind of like pawn sacrifice. You have to make like one of these knight moves. I've got some cool videos if you're stubborn and really want to pull this off. I'm kind of like that player as well, again, which is why I've been on a bit of a losing streak. I like to try and out-theory my opponent, but with black, it's just a lot more difficult. Again, white is choosing the direction of the play. You have to be more careful. So especially in this e4, e5 variation, I would not play two knights against the Italian. To be honest with you, even going back to an empty board, up against e4, I wouldn't even play e5. e5 is actually just really difficult because there's so much theory you need to know to play this well if your opponent is throwing you into those sharp lines. So we just saw the fried liver. There's the Danish gambit, which can look like this. And if you just start gobbling up all the pawns, you can get, oh, sorry, wrong move. You can get this situation where basically white has these laser beam bishops. And you can see the engine thinks this is good for black, but trust me, you want nothing to do with this unless you know exactly what you're doing. That's an extreme example, but there's even the Scotch gambit, which is super popular. So knight f3, knight c6. You play the Scotch, you take, and then they don't take back with their knight. They instead play bishop c4. And this is scary. When they don't take that pawn back, they can always gambit the pawn as well and then bring their knight out. Yeah, you don't want anything to do with this. So e4, e5, it's very difficult. I'll give you some alternatives a bit later, but I'll cover one d4 opening as black you definitely want to avoid first. So against d4, the main opening you want to avoid, well, you can start with d5. d5 is totally fine, but when you're up against the queen's gambit, please do not take this pawn. This is the most common move for the amateur level, 0 to 1500, and it scores the worst. White already has a 56% win rate after move 2, which is just not, it's just not great. And there's a few reasons for this. So this move is totally fine at the Grandmaster level. There's plenty of players who do this. There's actually nothing wrong theoretically with this move, but practically there's a few problems. So already you're kind of violating that principle that you want to control the center, because basically you're trading away a pawn on the side of the board for your center pawn. So that's not great from a fundamental perspective. But more importantly, and this again kind of goes back to that fried liver idea, where you generally don't want to try and out-theory your opponent as black. Basically, a lot of players try and hold on to the pawn. This is, again, the most common line, but you'll play something like e3, then if they play b5, just like saying, look, I've got that pawn, I'm hanging onto it, you can then play a4 as white, you can then try and hold on with c6, and basically there's a line here. See if you can spot the move that just pretty much instantly wins for white here. Again, if you don't know the theory, it might be hard to see this one coming. It's queen f3. And suddenly, that rook is completely trapped. It comes out of nowhere, and so many players fall into this trap who are just trying to take that pawn and just keep hold of it. So avoid this, try and play something simpler, avoid these sharp lines as black, even in the d4 openings. So before I show you some openings that are great statistically, I want to quickly mention chessblueprints.com. It's a website I've been working on. It generates puzzles from your own chess.com or Lichess games. So sign up, type in your username, and you'll get puzzles that look a bit like this on screen. So I'm going to give you two openings with the white pieces that do awesome statistically, and they're going to try and get black into those traps that we said they want to avoid with the black pieces. So we want an opening that's kind of rare so that our opponent isn't just super comfortable in getting those like high accuracy games. And you want an opening with a lot of traps as well, because the traps is what gets those really high percentage win rates when your opponent is a bit too greedy and trying to out-theory you. So I'll do one for e4 and d4. So if you're an e4 player, what I recommend is up against e5, which is most of the time, try out the Vienna. So instead of playing knight f3 like everyone else does, you want to try playing knight c3. And the idea of the Vienna is, let's say if they play knight f6, you want to push your f-pawn. So you want to try and get your f-pawn in front of the knight most of the times in the Vienna. And it makes it a lot more of an aggressive opening. It means you can castle kingside and instantly your rook will be involved on that semi-open file, which is great. But again, it has this trap. This is the Vienna Gambit. A lot of players will take here, and already it's like 58% win rate for white. It's probably more once they actually take the pawn. It's already 58% win rate after this move. Trust me, it's ridiculous. Because basically, if they take, which looks super normal, you play e5, and this knight has nowhere to go. These are covered by the knight. These two squares are covered by the queen. A lot of people will just blunder that straight up, but the knight has to go back, and you get a massive center. You get knight f3 first to block this check. It's a great opening. So try out the Vienna. It's super solid. It's also very similar to the knight f3, knight c6 stuff that we said to avoid earlier. So if you're an e4 player, you should be pretty comfortable. And now for our d4 opening, if you like being a d4 player, what I'd recommend is the Jobava London. So it's very similar to the London, but you delay it a little bit and you play knight c3. Again, very similar to the Vienna actually. And the idea behind this is you bring your bishop out to the normal London square, but in the London, you normally have a pawn here on c3. It's a lot more not as aggressive, but with the Jobava London, you're always threatening to jump this knight forward, and black actually doesn't respect it a lot. The most common move at the amateur level is knight c6, which is just a straight up blunder. The engine says plus 0.6 for white, but trust me, it's a lot better because you jump the knight forward, and there's no good way to defend this pawn, which is also a fork on the king and the rook. Basically, black has to know this theoretical line where they have to sack a pawn, you take with the bishop, they have to jump their knight over here, and then you're already a pawn up. Basically, you play e3, they take the bishop, and you're absolutely chilling. So this happens a lot in the Jobava London. So again, it's rare. It has this trap that everyone falls into. There's also another funny variation here where if they jump forward with the knight, you can sack your queen. You can just play queen takes pawn, and if the queen recaptures, which, I mean, they do literally 100% of the time, I think. I haven't had anyone not do it. You play a knight c6, you fork the king and the queen back, And what they take, they move, and you're 3 pawns up in the opening. So the Joe Bava is awesome. It's very similar to the London if you already play that, so give it a go with the white pieces. So now I'll give you 2 opening recommendations for the black pieces, one against e4 and one against d4. So what we're looking for with black is we don't want anything too theoretical. Again, white will always have the edge there because they're kind of dictating the play. You want something simple, but we don't want it to be too common as well. You do want to get an edge out of the opening with black. So against e4, what I think you should play, and I mean, it just feels unfair and almost like boring how easy it is. I'm not joking. You want to play the Caro-Kann. The Caro-Kann, already, I'm pretty sure black is like better statistically after move 1 with the black pieces, which is just, again, it's just silly, but it is what it is. The Caro-Kann is just so good because basically there's 2 ways to play it. So basically, you play d5. Most players will push, but if they play anything else, like if they exchange, this is a super easy position to play, but still a bit rare, so people aren't too good at it. Or if they take their knight out, you just capture, you recapture, and you get this kind of game. Again, it's pretty easy, and it's still unique. It's not that e4, e5 that everyone is used to. But what you'll get most of the time is they'll push e5, and don't play this variation. Don't play the variation with f5, because again, this gets a bit theoretical. As white, I love to play the towel against this, where you play h4, and if black's not careful, they just instantly get their bishop trapped. This bishop literally has nowhere to go, and you lose the game on move 4. So again, we don't want to play these kind of theoretical openings. The Caro-Kann is great, but this bishop f5 variation can be a bit theoretical. So I really like just pushing the c5 pawn. And basically the plan is, this looks a bit like a French. You're basically just trying to attack this pawn, but you want to get this bishop out. So most of your games will look like this, where they'll play knight f3, you bring the bishop out, maybe they'll check you, you bring the knight forward. And the plan is just to pile up on that pawn. You can bring the queen out, this knight can do that maneuver. It's really easy to play, and you just play along the c-file. So super easy plan. You've already dictated the way the game in your own direction as black, which is normally white's benefit. And yeah, I couldn't recommend this highly enough. It is so, so good. So with the black pieces against d4, I'm going to give you a few options. I've struggled to find a really consistent opening I like as black against the white pieces. I'm not going to lie, it's just a bit more difficult. For some reason, I think d4 kind of like forces more normal games. So one fun way you can play is up against the Queen's Gambit. I used to play the Albin counter gambit a lot. You play e5, which just looks silly, and you push your pawn forward, and it's a really fun game. Now, the problem I had with this was when you're playing against the Queen's Gambit, you just don't get it much because you're playing against e4 a lot. And this is what I was talking about, trying to like out-theory your opponents as black. It's just you're not getting this that much, so it's actually hard to even like remember the theory when you get it. So I found that a little difficult personally, but that's what I did, and I found it a lot of fun. Statistically, yeah, if our ideology with black is we want to kind of like bring the game in our own unique direction, kind of like we did with the Caro, and try and avoid some theory, the King's Indian can be pretty good for that. So this is the King's Indian setup. You basically fianchetto your bishop super early, and you give them the full center, and you castle super early, and this is what you're after. Now, I blame this opening for my 300-point drop, and I'm not joking. I was trying to play like c5 variations of it, and I just found it very difficult. I got steamrolled. White would castle queenside and just destroy me in opposite side castling. So personally, I can't recommend this, but statistically, it does pretty well. So definitely try that out. I think the best shot against d4 is to play the Slav. And it's funny because it looks a bit similar to the Caro, but say you're playing c4, you basically play c6, and you just try and play really solid. Just try and get your knights out, get your bishop out when you're ready. Just try and play a super solid game, and just accept that against d4 especially, you can't try and out-theory them. It's just a little too hard. Same thing works against the London as well. So if they play the London, bishop f4, you can just mirror them. This is kind of annoying if you're a London player as well, because they're just copying your moves. So yeah, I definitely recommend this for the black pieces, and the Caro for, this for the d4 against d4, and the Caro against e4. So that's all the openings I have to suggest. My favorite one out of all the ones I showed you is definitely the Joe Bava London, where you play knight c6 and bring your bishop out. This is my favorite by far, and I have a really in-depth video on this opening in particular. So it should be above me. Click that. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I'd really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one.